Whenever I do one of my illustration videos, I like going over all the various equipment that I use in order to do one of these illustrations. Keep in mind, none of this is sponsored. Nobody's paying me or providing any equipment for me to use. This is all stuff I've picked up over the years. The initial sketch for this particular piece is done on my tablet. This is my Samsung Galaxy Tab 6 Lite using the S Pen. Using the program iBiz Paint. I like it a lot for doing initial sketch work. Once I had that basic idea done, the composition completed, I will then switch over to using a Strathmore Bristol pad, typically 100-pound smooth surface, working at 11 inches by 17 inches, and do a pencil layout at first. This is done using a 2H Staedtler pencil. I don't show a ton of this part on the videos because it really doesn't pick up on camera very well. But instead, I'll show more of the inking process, which is done with a Speedball lettering pen and Speedball super black ink, and usually a couple of brushes in there as well for larger black areas. Tight detail will usually be done with the Faber-Castell Pitt artist pens. I have a few different sizes that I'll swap between. When it's mostly done, I can then go back and do some white highlights and different effects using the Dr. P.H. Martin's Bombay white ink and a dedicated Speedball lettering pen just for this. You can see from all the white on that. When the inked portion is completed, it's then scanned into my PC and then switching over to working in Photoshop for the coloring stage. I have my Huion. This is not a touch tablet. You have to use the stylus for this one. This is a Huion Kamvas Pro 2.5K. And if you're familiar with this one, you'll actually see that I'm using it upside down. The buttons on it are on the right-hand side instead of the left, and I have them all disabled because I typically use a keyboard for all the hotkeys. Starting off this illustration with the Samsung tablet, I'm just wanting to work on the idea of a cyberpunk style mechanic, possibly somebody working on the facility that I'm basing. That's basically the main setting in this upcoming cyberpunk story I'm working on. This multi-level facility here in Winnipeg in this, kind of dark future setting. So my idea was just coming up with the idea of this cyborg character who would be a mechanic operating on the installation itself, and then working out the rough idea of the pose for the character, going over the whole composition, moving her around in the frame, which I just find to be a little bit easier to do when I'm sketching it out on this tablet. Like I mentioned earlier, this is the Samsung Galaxy Tab 6 Lite using iBiz Paint. I don't tend to use it for painting very much. I much prefer it for sketching. Much the same as with Photoshop. It's very easy to create illustrations on different layers, move them around in space, resize everything. It's a nice way to play with composition very easily. Just kind of figure out the overall idea before I end up wanting to put it onto paper, and then redrawing it in pencil first, and then in the final ink stage. Even though the whole thing winds up back in Photoshop again when I scan it for painting. I'm using much the same techniques here that I would be using if I was sketching with pencil in one of my sketchbooks. It's just a little bit faster. It can sometimes be more convenient working with the tablet. In this particular instance, I've got it set up the same way I would at my drawing table if I was using paper. But in a lot of instances, though, if you go through like my Instagram and different things, you'll see a lot of concept sketches specifically for this particular building setting. These black and white and gray illustrations. All of those were actually done on this tablet. Again, it's very easy to be able to move elements around in space, rethink ideas, resize stuff very quickly. so that when I go to do the final illustrations and the final storytelling in that actual setting, I've got a really good guide to work from, being able to figure out just how many stories there are in a particular structure, how far away. The main, I keep referring to it as an orphanage in my notes, but it's actually this troubled teen center, I suppose. How far away that is from other things that are in the environment. There's going to be a major plot point involving that structure and involving a drug making facility not that far away from it. So I had to kind of be able to situate those both in space, and really nailing down the design with this tablet was a little bit easier. Just, again, it's just so much more convenient to be able to move the pieces around in space, constantly drawing over the original. The way I approach that when I'm wanting to just keep redrawing it, I'll do a very quick sketch. Then I'll drop down the opacity of the layer that sketch is sitting on. And then, like you're seeing right here, when I'm working on her eyes, those eyes are actually being sketched out on another layer with a higher opacity than the original sketch layer, which is why they look so much darker here. That way I can still follow my original lines, but they're not as intrusive. It's much easier to figure out, okay, where were the eyes actually supposed to be, or where do I actually want them in space in relation to the rest of the head. And that works for me with regard to all the various drawing elements, whether it's individual pieces on a figure, whether it's elements of a building or some other piece of construction, the various equipment that the character is carrying, things like that. Just being able to move it around, realize, oh yeah, the length of that arm is totally wrong. The anatomy needs a lot of work. Much easier to just keep drawing over and over and over again on progressively lighter layers in the background. Now, having said all that, that's actually a very similar technique to what I do with pencil. If I'm sketching in a sketchpad, when I'm doing initial sketch work, I tend to have a very light touch. And I'll end up when I'm working with pencil, I tend to draw fairly lightly, and then find the line that I want, go over that particular line much darker, rather than going in and erasing anything. It's really just building up these darker and darker lines so that the original lines that I put down aren't actually being can't be seen anymore. If you take a look at some of the other videos I've posted here on YouTube, some of the 60-second shorts or other ones where I'm just doing the pencil illustration and all the texture is being done with pencil, you can actually see how I tend to build up from a very light pencil to a very dark one without ever really using an eraser, except for doing certain special effects. There are a few illustrations I've done that are set in the snow, where it's actually the snow is actually falling in the illustration, and in those cases, I do pull out an electric eraser and put in the snowfall effects afterwards. In general, though, I don't really like using an eraser while I'm putting together original compositions, while I'm working on pencil pieces. I just prefer drawing the original concept a lot lighter and then building it up so it's much darker as I go along. So it's a similar procedure to what I'm doing here with the tablet. Just with the tablet, I get to change that opacity as I go along. Oh yeah, and here's one of the more important elements of the majority of cyberpunk work. Some cybernetic bit of equipment, her arm. Although notably, one of the biggest influences on the entire cyberpunk genre, Blade Runner, has no cybernetics in it whatsoever. You're either human or you're a replicant. There really isn't any sort of in-between, except for, what's in your memories. Neuromancer, less so, because Molly clearly has a whole ton of cybernetic implants, but many other people including the protagonist case, don't really have much of anything. So the setting that this piece is taking in, this piece is taking place in, it's some sort of equipment cupboard, almost like where Jeffrey's tubes would be in the Star Trek Enterprise or something like that. Basically just a closet full of electronics off to one side on one of these levels. She has access to all the machinery and all the control machinery on any given level in the particular structure she's working in. I wanted to give her a lot of different bits that she could interact with, like her the arm, the cybernetic arm is actually holding on to a long handle. One original I thought I had with that was that it was actually the handle to a glass fronted freezer. It's I'm still using glass effects on that door. It may or may not be anything that's particularly cold in there. I didn't define that in the final illustration, but that was the original impetus. But with her right hand, she's pulling out a piece of equipment from above to examine it. The original concept looked a little bit more, and you can see the sort of bottle shape in there. Yeah, it was a little bit more shaped like some sort of wine bottle or something. But eventually, I went with a much more inorganic shape, something closer almost to like the siren, the flashing lights from a mid 70s to mid 80s cop car, and then added a bunch of extra bits on that. In this initial idea, I have wires coming off of it that still go back up into the structure. I ended up dropping that so that I can I can show a bit more of the background behind her. But I'm still dealing with a lot of wiring, a lot of those elements to keep getting repeated. But with this initial sketch, I concentrated mostly on the character and then built the environment around her. So working from the front backwards, so from front to back. But you'll notice later, when I'm getting into the actual inking and then the painting, I do the opposite. I work from the back to the front. The initial composition, basically I want to start with what is the most important element? What is the focus of this particular illustration? And in this case, it is the mechanic wearing the astral hobo t-shirt, some sort of band in this future civilization. Creating the business that she's doing in this environment. And then I build the environment behind her, specifically the particular cabinet she's working in. And then it recedes far off into the distance into this huge space, like a very, very oversized mall with a few other people wandering behind her. And then going in with some more gray tones just to figure out lighting patterns. And yeah, so you can see the glass front on that cabinet that she has her hand on, the handle of. It's unclear if that actually opens, but mostly it was just to play with some reflections. I really, really like playing with some reflecting effects. It's one of the things that always attracts me to working on metal. And characters like Iron Man, is I really, really love playing with reflections. So I do a lot of work with metal. I do a lot of work with water, characters standing in water or other water features around them. So in this one, we've got the main one being that slab of glass to the one side. Not a full-on mirror, but some hints of reflective effects in there. And then here I'm drawing in a white border around her to further separate her from the background. This is still just playing with the idea of the composition, but haven't got into the final piece just yet. But we're almost done figuring out where everything is in space, and then how I'll end up translating that onto paper, which will then get scanned into the computer and be colored in Photoshop. So here we've got the finished initial sketch. Switching over to 100-pound Strathmore Bristol pad, smooth surface, 11-inch by 17-inch. This is the normal size that I work at, and all the comic pages I do are done on this same paper. I don't use pre-lined pages. I tend to just like buying these large Strathmore pads, and then I'll lay out the borders on my own. It's just how I've always preferred working. But I'll lay out the initial sketch with a 2H Staedtler pencil. I'm not showing a ton of it here because, as you can see, the camera really doesn't pick it up very well. In real life, it shows up a little bit darker than this, but not a lot. I just want it to be super faint so that when I start going over it with inks, and then I scan it later, the pencil lines really won't interfere. It'll pick up a fairly clean. The scanner will pick up the ink lines fairly cleanly. Now I am starting in on the traditional inking using a Speedball lettering pen and the Speedball Super Black ink. I was outlining a few elements on the character, but that was so that I could start working on the background behind her. All the elements that approach her, that touch her. Where they touch her, I want to make sure there's an outline of the character, but I don't want to start drawing any of the interior parts of the character yet, the actual detail on her just yet. I want to create the setting, really get a better sense of, I know what the setting is supposed to be. It's all drawn out, or at least one pass of it's drawn out on the tablet to the left there, and then my initial pencil sketch. But as I'm building it up with the inks, I'm tweaking the lighting as I go, figuring out where smaller light sources are, how much they'll actually affect the character, so that when I get to the main character herself, the lighting that I'm putting on her will seem a little bit more natural. I won't be trying to force lighting on her that doesn't come from some obvious source. I'm even thinking about lighting sources that the viewer can't see. That would be, in the foreground, basically behind where the viewer would be. But for the most part, I try to give an impression, some sort of clue in the drawing itself as to where the lighting is that's going to be falling on her. Now, much of the lighting in this illustration that's falling on her will end up coming from that cabinet to the right of frame, to the left of her, and just to the further right of frame, past the edge of the frame. Like a lot of the lighting in here will actually be from the point of view of the viewer, or to the right of the viewer, but it'll still make sense because it's affecting the rest of the background the same way. So it won't look like there's a spotlight on her that doesn't affect anything else in the environment. If I get the lighting to match on her and in the environment, it makes everything feel a little bit more real, like she's actually inhabiting a real space. There are times where it works really well to have the lighting on the main character different than the lighting in the environment. And the last illustration I posted, the last illustration video I posted up here on my YouTube channel, involved a character standing on a gangplank, or on a on a walkway, and much further behind her, several hundred feet behind her, was this massive statue. Those two elements were so far apart in space, it actually made sense, and it reinforced that idea, to have the lighting hitting the statue differently than it was hitting the main character. The lighting was coming from different directions because there was so much space between them. Light would be affecting each of them differently. But if you have two elements where lighting is affecting them identically, that actually pushes them really close together in space. So that would work really well to make sure that you understand they're the same size, they're the same height. Anyway, so I got the deep background completed, all those tiny elements of the various levels of the interior of this space, a quick pass on all those characters walking in the background, and then the interior space of this cabinet that she's working on and working in. That was all done with that speedball lettering pen. Now that I'm inking the main character herself, I want a little bit more control. I want to put in a bit tighter detail. So I've switched over to using these Faber-Castell Pitt pens. They're really, really nice for doing this super tight detail. Just do a quick pass over her, outlining all the major pieces on the character, the shirt, the various cables, the glasses, all that. Right here, I'm inking this retro style computer, loosely based on an old Radio Shack Tandy Model 100 portable computer from the early 80s. I have a soft spot for that kind of stuff because I would have been around 10 or 11 when that computer came out, and at that time it would have looked like the future to me. And frankly, for me, the entire cyberpunk aesthetic looks very 80s, and I'll always put in a lot of 80s elements into any illustrations like this. It's the whole cyberpunk thing really is the future if that the 80s were predicting. Things went in slightly different directions, as you know, will always end up happening. And then once I've outlined all those major elements, I'll go back in and start doing some inking effects. This will do a better job of showing how light is hitting her, how it's affecting the various textures, and how the texture of her shirt is inked slightly differently than the texture of the goggles wrapped around, sitting around her neck, how it'll affect the texture on the belts and on her jeans or her pants a little bit differently. Just to indicate that some surfaces are smoother, some are rougher, some fold a lot and some don't fold at all. It's just a very handy way to further define, again, where the light is coming from. And, helps with the overall storytelling in this piece. Now that I've got the major inking done, I'm going in with a paintbrush and using that same Speedball Super Black ink, painting in, using the paintbrush to ink in these large flat areas. The hair has very little detail. I wanted it to be basically this jet black hair that really doesn't reflect any light, and then putting in these larger areas of black on the pants. So even in black and white, the pants and the shirt appear to be two different colors, even though there are no colors on either of them. Those large areas or small areas of black will help define the intent of what the color is supposed to end up being. And as to the skin of the character, I've put in extremely little detail. I want to leave all that, or most of that, just for the coloring stage. Now, the final stage is to take some white ink, in this case, Dr. P.H. Martin's Bombay White, and a different Speedball lettering pen, put a quick outline around the main character to help pull her just a little bit forward from the rest of the illustration, and then throw in some additional touch-ups, some white reflections on the area where, on the glass, so that it's indicating that some of the light in the area, in the environment, is reflecting off of that a little bit differently than it is other things. And then, of course, putting in my signature in the heavy black areas in white. So, yeah, now we've got, I want to make sure with these pieces, the inked portion is a standalone finished illustration. It tells a story all by itself, and then finally sits inside one of my inked portfolio cases. And once that part is done, it is then scanned. I scan this at 1200 DPI at full size. So the image you're seeing in front of you here is 11 by 17. It's actually a little bit larger because you can see there's a wider black border around it. Scanned at 1200 DPI, And then I drop the resolution down to 600 for painting. I find that if I tried to paint at 1200 dpi, the file becomes almost unmanageably big. Now, to play with some lighting effects, I actually selected all the line art behind her. Anything that's behind the cabinet, the cabinet that she's in, I'm selecting that and putting it on a different layer. This is going to be to make it easier for me to be able to put in some lighting effects that will affect that deep background differently. That'll end up affecting her. Like I said, if you're wanting, when I was talking about the previous piece where the woman was standing on a walkway and several hundred feet behind her was this giant statue, I wanted the light to affect each of those elements differently to show that sense of space. I'm going to do the same thing here with this deep background. Like, she's really far forward in the frame. You figure even the that first woman behind her is probably about 80 or so feet behind her. So I want there to be this lighting effect falling over all of it. That will show that she's kind of on a different plane almost, in the illustration sense. So it brings her further forward in the frame. All the stuff that's behind her is further behind her. It's creating the setting, but it's not, the illustration isn't about that background. It's about her. Right now, I'm putting down a bunch of flat colors in that deep background. Those flat colors are not the colors that this will end up being. It's not, they're not the colors that I'll end up painting that background with. They're just kind of holding colors. So I can choose them later. I can select them later after I've done this. The flatting section is referred to as laying down flat colors. Now, what's maybe not so easy to tell is basically the background layer are those flat colors in the deep background. The background line art is just the line art for that background. All that element, all those parts that I was cutting out, putting onto a separate channel, and then I end up creating as a separate layer. Then there's the main painting layer, and that's all the flatting I'm doing right now. So the flatting on the flat colors I'm putting on the character and on the cabinet that she's in, that's on a layer above the background line art. So I can actually create another layer between the background line art and this layer, and it will only affect the deep background colors and the deep background layer. It won't affect any of the foreground colors. So all of the background and foreground elements have been flatted. I'm going to start painting the deep background. The deep background is going to be painted mostly cool colors and a fairly simple style of painting. The more detailed and the more complicated you make your painting, the further forward in space you're going to end up bringing all those elements. And the background, as much as I want it to look good and I want it to tell a story on its own, it's not the primary story. And the primary focus of this is going to be on this main character. So most of the lighting decisions already exist. They're already in the line art itself. This coloring here is really just meant to enhance that. Show different colors of light, play with a few different directions of light, but all of that is really established in the line art itself. Here I'm highlighting it a little bit differently. The primary lighting behind her is blue. It's mostly blue light sources behind her, but these pink panels I've got here, they're going to be changed to a much darker magenta, but those are throwing off this purple light. So I'm already playing with that purple lighting in the environment to show this is how that light is falling on the underside of these various layers, of these various levels. But then on the front part of these levels, it'll be switching back to the blues like I've got going here, just showing how lighting is affecting in different directions, giving it a sense of mass, a sense of everything being three-dimensional, but none of it's contradicting the line art that I've done. I'm not fighting the lighting choices I already made. This is just to enhance it and to work with it. And now working on the bottom level, the one that's closest to her, and on the same, plane, basically the same level that she's standing on, but playing with the same kind of ideas. There'll be these purple lights below everything, and now I'm actually starting to paint some of those lights here, but mostly painted in the reflections, and then a bluer light coming from above. I'm figuring the interior of this giant mall-type space is mostly lit by these larger lights way, way up in the ceiling. Like, this is part of a massive structure. Each one of these segments that she's in, that comprises these things. These wrote these giant 10-story tall open areas ringed by these various levels. And now playing with this same kind of lighting pattern on these characters in the background. Again, I don't want to do a ton of detail with the coloring to go with the style of illustration I've already done. I don't want to put in much more detail on the coloring than I did with the line art, so that they don't really compete with the main character. There'd be enough detail in there to show that, yep, they exist and they are moving through space. They are being affected by the lighting in the environment. They have their own individual stories, but they won't be as important to the story being told in this particular image as the main character. So they're more serving that main story than anything else. Here's where I was talking about creating an additional layer, that FX001 and then FX002, that's creating more lighting patterns. Kind of going for a Ridley Scott fog effect, where there's this diffuse lighting going over everything, initially from the top, casting that blue light. But then I created another layer to put in these purple lights and more magenta style lights from below and from those individual light sources in that setting, and played with a few more. Actually ended up going a little bit brighter. And now I'm getting into painting this cabinet area. And again, I'm working from the background, from the back to the front. So I painted all of that deep background. Now that I'm working on the same plane as the main character, I'm still painting all the elements surrounding her before I actually get to painting her. Because as I paint, even with all the lighting decisions having previously been made in the line art, as I go along, I'm adding some new ideas. The direction of light and the intensity of light won't really change all that much, but I will be playing with different colors of light and how, because if you have a red light source casting onto a blue surface, that blue surface will reflect back that red light source, but it will also reflect it back a more purple, because some of the blue in that surface will end up being reflected back. So that will change the color of lighting on a different thing, on a different element in that same environment, because it's now being affected by this slightly purplish red light due to the reflection. I try to keep things like that in mind. Again, a lot of that is just to make this a living space. If I change the color of light as it's interacting with different surfaces, with different colors, it makes everything seem a little bit more real. Makes everything feel like it may not be our reality, but it is a reality. It's a valid space, and it makes whatever's going on in that space feel more real for the viewer. I want, it's part of all making an emotional connection with the viewer and the illustration, and specifically the focus of any given illustration I'm working on. So, and I also want to just build up the setting, so that all those choices I've made in the setting, all the various ways that color is affecting the setting, how light is affecting the setting, will then be reflected into the main character. And if there's a huge red light beside the main character, if I don't put a red light, or at least a notion of that red light on the character, she will end up looking really artificial. She'll look like she's just like she's been green screened into a movie. You know, she's not interacting with the setting at all. And I don't want to do that. I want to make sure that that she looks like she is part of this environment. So it isn't just a matter of creating the character. It's a matter of creating the character and the setting. I do some illustration work where it's just one or two characters and no setting. There are times when that's valid. There are times when that makes sense to do. Certainly, when I was doing more commercial work, there'd be times that that was the job, that was the request. But in general, I much prefer doing illustrations where I am also creating the setting the characters living in, because that tells you something about the character themselves. Why are they in this environment? She's looking a lot different than she would, even wearing the same outfit, if she was standing on a beach or standing beside a river. But she's in a very particular environment, this high-tech, run-down environment. So the fact that she's carrying all these tools probably means something in particular. Even if I'm not explicitly talking about anything like that, even if I'm not doing like a story page, I still like having elements of there's more going on than just a character standing. I want the viewer to feel like there is some sort of story going on. For me, that's what I prefer doing. That's why I draw. Is it isn't just about creating a cool character design or just wanting to draw a picture of Iron Man or something like that. I want to draw a picture of Iron Man doing a particular thing and, having a purpose for being in this particular shot, for being in this particular place at this particular time. This person here, this mechanic, is in this high-tech closet, it's in this server room or whatever it is for a particular reason. She's there to do a job. We don't know what it is specifically. We don't necessarily have to. We just have to have the sense that there's a purpose to being here. This could be just another day on the job for her. But, that even that tells a story. You can see that I'm dealing with a blue light on the left hand of frame and to the left and below to the character to the left and below the character. To the right, there is a much more red pinkish light. So to the right and above for the character, affecting everything about the character, affecting all the elements on her, but it affects them differently depending on what type of material. Whether it's a skin tone, whether it's the t-shirt material, whether it's this cybernetic arm, how it's interacting with him will tell you a lot. Like clearly this is not a very chromed, it's super advanced cybernetic arm, right? Frankly, at the moment, it's looking a little bit rusty. As I go along and start brushing away some of the brown tones on it, putting in a bit more contrast, putting in a higher albedo. It doesn't look quite as rusty, but it's definitely not chromed out. It's got a much more utilitarian look to it. It's clear that, she's not worried about the arm being particularly fashionable. It's much more about being able to do something. Like with the background and with the setting, I still work from the outside in. I still tend to work from the back to the front. I was dealing with all the various elements on the character, all the bits that she's wearing, and now I'm going into tighter details, like the lips there. We're working with the blue. And then finally ending on the skin tones. With most of the painting, I was using this select gradient style of painting that we were using a lot back in my days at Digital Chameleon. I'm doing a little bit of that here on the skin tones as well, but rather than just selecting things and then using the gradient tool to do all the painting, here I'm selecting areas that I want to be painted, but then using an airbrush tool, and then hand painting most of the actual rendering, the actual painting, making it a lot softer. Essentially, one way to to look at painting on people, the more lines you add, whether it's in the line art or using harder edge brushes, the older you end up making characters look, the softer you make the selections, the younger they end up looking. So even if I wanted to make the character look quite a bit older, I'll still start with some soft painting and then start going in with a harder edge brush to put in much sharper lines to age them. It's much easier to paint somebody looking relatively young and then add more detail to make them look older than to try to do it the other way around, and to put in a lot of detail and then try and soften it all. But yeah, in this case, I'm putting in these hard edges really just to denote where there are hard shadows being cast. The equipment, any particularly dense fabric will cast a very hard shadow, whereas musculature is casting a much softer shadow on anything else around it. So all this other detail is being done with a softer airbrush. The actual, it's using the paintbrush tool here, but with a soft airbrush edge to it. The primary light was coming from the right and above frame. Now I'm putting in that secondary light, this bluer light from the left and from below frame. Adding in, and it isn't just putting in a blue lighting effect, it still has to interact with the characters. So it still follows the musculature of the character. It will still follow the bone structure under them. If like in this case, the waist is tilted away from that light source, there'll only be a little bit on the edge, whereas underneath the arm, it's pointing more directly at that bluer light source. So there's a stronger blast of it. It's a bit purer there. And especially here on the face, I want to make sure that the jawline will pick up that blue to really separate it from the rest of the figure. So adding it along the edge of the neck, but I'm going to put it a much more direct, much more obvious line on the jaw. So I actually select that. So I'm not going to paint outside of this area. Each of these layers that I'm painting on have been, I select that large area, the large flat area of color. That's why I put down the flat areas. Put that onto a separate layer and lock that layer so I can paint on it without affecting anything around it. And then I end up collapsing it back onto the original layer once that portion's done. Now, all the painting has been completed. All the deep background effects have been put in. Now I want to start touching up effects in the foreground on her and on this interior space. So there is a red light being cast from the right of frame. I already have that in the painting itself, but I want to reinforce that by putting in this glowing effect. So it'll affect the line art as well and have that interact with these other displays I've got in here as well. Don't want them to completely overpower everything. It's just kind of brushing this red light over, but it's not turning the line art red. It's interacting with it and creating kind of a red glowing effect. But it's very clear that we still have the original line art sitting underneath it. I'm not fundamentally completely changing the color of it, but it's more just, adding a little bit more life and energy, indicating light up panels in the space. And then I'm going to start playing with some other colors in that environment. There's still that blue affecting the character and some of the background elements. So I want to create some additional blue lighting, but I also want to put in these white reflective spots. There are a few places that are super, super reflective. Like I said, this arm isn't chromed out, but it's not completely rusted out either. So it will reflect some things back almost completely white. That's just the nature of a lot of metal. So the piece of equipment that she's holding onto has these small hot spots. So I was adding that in there. There's some of my robot pieces will have a lot more of that. They never quite look full on like the Cylons from the original 1970s Battlestar Galactica, the disco robots, but it can get pretty reflective. So now I want to brush in more of a blue, dealing with it. Again, talking about the blue that was coming from below and to the left of frame, but also want to have, some additional lighting here and there just off panel, giving the overall illustration a little bit more life. Creating that sense of it being this cyberpunk universe is very kind of 80s thing. I'm dealing with a lot of traditional 80s colors and fog effects. So there's a lot of red or magenta on one side and blue or cyans getting into purples on the other. And now here we've definitely got a nice softer blue coming from the left of frame and below, affecting all the line art. Now those glowing effects in the deep foreground also end up affecting the line art in the deep background. And here we've got the final piece. So thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you had a good time with it.